As the King approached Parliament, some of the record 335 new MPs were being told what to expect of this moment.
Blackwood will be coming down to do her thing. Please stay where you are.
The government boasts it's outdone Tony Blair's first session of Parliament in 1997, with 40 bills announced in today's King's speech. Inside, old hands pointed out to new arrivals the quaint titles and traditions. The King and Queen were received by two hereditary peers, who, under a bill announced today, will be the last ones left in the House of Lords. The Lord Great Chamberlain and the Earl Marshal will say goodbye to their fellow 90 hereditary peers. The only bit of constitutional reform that's scraped into these plans. The Labour leadership believes voters want them focused on economic growth and improving public services.
My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all.
Scores of new MPs crammed outside the Lords to catch a glimpse of the grandeur.
I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
England's performance in the Euros dominated the affable chat between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak on their way back to the Commons, and for several minutes once they were back in the chamber. The sharp, shouty exchanges in the TV debates seemed, for a moment, like a thing of the past.
If I may offer some words of advice to members opposite. On the government benches, life comes at you fast. Soon you might be fortunate enough to be tapped on the shoulder and offered a junior ministerial role. Then you'll find yourself attending Cabinet, then in the Cabinet, and then when the Prime Minister's position becomes untenable, you might end up being called to the highest office. And before you know it, you have a bright future behind you, and you are left wondering whether you can credibly be an elder statesman at the age of 44. Now, it is right to begin by congratulating the Prime Minister on his decisive victory in the election. He deserves the goodwill of all of us in this House as he takes on the most demanding of jobs in the increasingly uncertain world in which we now live. Now, the party opposite has successfully tapped into the public's desire for change.
I want to thank the right honourable gentleman. In every exchange that we've had since the election, and in his words today, he has gone well beyond the usual standards of generosity, and I thank him for that. And in that spirit, this King's speech picks up some of the important business not concluded in the last session.
As well as picking up the phased smoking ban that Rishi Sunak abandoned to call a snap election, the government will also pick up the Tories' plan to establish a new independent football regulator and push their own version of the Tories' long-standing promise to stop arbitrary evictions. But as Westminster slowly returned to normal outside, so inside too. Rishi Sunak accused the government of feigning horror at the shock state of the national finances they'd discovered on coming into office.
I understand well that the Chancellor is keen to paint as bleak a picture as possible, but I would just gently point out that this is not exactly what the facts say. Inflation at 2%, unemployment 4%, and the fastest growing economy in the G7 so far this year.
The former Prime Minister also challenged Labour's net zero plans.
If the government puts the speed of doing this ahead of family finances and our energy security, then we will again lose public consent for the measures necessary to ensure that we actually reach our 2050 net zero target. So I hope that the Energy Secretary reflects on those thoughts.
He so hated the idea of industrial strategy, the term was banned from meetings. The new government's programme, announced today, is proudly interventionist. The government will set up a national wealth fund to deliver state funding to help with the decarbonisation of heavy industry. And it'll set up Great British Energy, a production company to help with the transition to green energy. And it'll put railways into public ownership as current franchises end. The government will also impose new workers' rights on businesses and reverse Tory laws that make strike action more difficult. and give itself powers to overrule opposition to housing and infrastructure developments.
We take the brakes off Britain, go further and faster on measures to generate higher economic growth. Workers and business united in the cause of wealth creation.
One Tory MP said much of rural Britain was panicked by his new regime.
People in rural communities around the country see the vast majority which the Right Honourable Gentleman has assembled, and they're afraid. They see a manifesto in which just 87 words are used about farming. They see a king's speech. They see a king's speech with no mention of rural communities or rural priorities.
I think that if you look at the places that are now represented on these benches, you'll see the reassurance that has been given that will also be given again.
Keir Starmer didn't use today to announce an instant lifting of the two-child benefit cap, but he conceded a review of child poverty and a new unit to study it. A defensive move at his first full Commons debate as Prime Minister, a sign of the challenges ahead.
Well, the Prime Minister stated that his plan starts with the economy and aims to fix the foundations of the nation. And he warned that change will not happen overnight. But does his programme go far enough when it comes to encouraging the growth the government and the country so desperately need? Let's take a closer look with our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi.
Chris, as you said, 40 bills and almost half of them are directed at improving the economy. Top of that list is anointing the Office for Budget Responsibility, the fiscal watchdog, with greater powers. You know, wonderful optics for the Labour Party as sober custodians of the public purse. It also prevents another Liz Truss type budget from happening. But it's kind of like fighting the previous war. Increasingly, institutions and economists are critical not about the OBR's legal standing, but about the fiscal framework that Labour have adopted and whether they can get to the kind of growth they keep talking about with that fiscal framework.
Right, how much growth is going to come from the planning changes?
Well, house building, as you know, is a big part of the failing story of the British economy, which is why Labour want to tackle it so quickly. Construction's not a huge component in GDP, but home ownership, massive part of how we feel as Brits. The question is, if you want to shift inequality with boosting housing supply, why not borrow more and build it yourself? If you take a look at council house building since the 1950s, you can see it basically drops off in the 1980s and essentially ceases to exist. Well, the reason they can't do this, Krish, is because they're hell-bent on sticking to that fiscal orthodoxy. Let's take a look at another thing, investment and how we compare to other G7 countries. We are falling behind every single other nation, and it is that kind of cash, Krish, that is going to turbo boost growth. And at the moment, capital investment is actually shrinking at the end of this Parliament.
Right, Labour got good news today, though, on inflation.
Well, this is my last chart. Let's look at goods inflation. That had peaked at 15%. It's coming down quite rapidly. Actually, prices are falling, down 1.4%, but it's services inflation in blue that is proving sticky and uncomfortable. It sort of ruins the idea that the Bank of England is going to come along in a couple of weeks and cut interest rates. That would have been good not just for mortgage borrowers, but for the new government, because it would have saved billions of pounds in debt interest payments. But Krish, the big thing here is that spending plans remain horrifically tight, and nothing in today's King's speech told us how Labour is going to deal with that. They keep talking about difficult decisions, but perhaps it's not until Rachel Reeves comes here in 2 weeks' time that we'll finally hear how they're going to deal with those kind of trade-offs.
Helia, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now here in Central Lobby is Darren Jones, who's the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the man who holds the purse strings. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's just begin with that point Helia was making about this new sort of guarantee that the OBR will always look into budgets. It prevents anything happening, you know, like the Liz Truss mini-budget again. But who are you controlling? I mean, you weren't going to do that anyway, were you? I mean, it's just politics, is my point.
Well, no, because we are giving new legal powers to the fiscal watchdog to ensure that whoever's in government at any point in the future, they can't repeat the mistakes that Liz Truss and the Conservatives made when they crashed the economy, put the country's finances and family finances
So you're trying
at
to
risk.
bind any successor?
Yeah, but also setting out the expected behaviour that the public can expect from a Labour government, where fiscal discipline is at the foundation of everything that we will do.
What about the question that giving the OBR such importance limits investment, and you've got to try and find that money somewhere else? Are you going to change any of the rules, any of the fiscal rules that keep us in this straitjacket?
Investors tell us the reason they can't spend money in the UK is not because of the Office for Budget Responsibility, it's because the planning system needs to be reformed. We need clear prioritisation around the country's needs. We need the skills in the labour market to be able to deliver the types of infrastructure we want to be invested in. And you've seen in the number of bills in the King's speech today our plans to be able to bring forward those reforms alongside stability to the economy to unlock the investment the country needs.
There's been a lot of speculation that you might be able to find some money by tinkering around the rules involving the Bank of England. And the interest that is paid to banks overnight, and also the amount of quantitative tightening, the reversing of quantitative easing that is going on. Is that all being considered at the moment as a way of finding more?
No, we've been very clear. The way in which we find more money to spend on public services is by growing the economy. If the UK had grown at the average rate of the wealthy nations over the past 14 years, this year I would have another £50 billion to spend on schools or hospitals.
So no freeze on tightening?
So our focus is absolutely on growth. That's the way to release more money for public services.
But is that ruling out a freeze in the tightening that the Bank of England is doing?
The Chancellor's already said in TV interviews that we're not planning on tinkering with policies in that way. We're going to do the proper hard work, yes, with the hard decisions to start with, but an absolute focus on growth to give sustainable revenue to the taxpayer, to the Exchequer for public services.
As Chief Secretary, you've got to work out how much each department's going to get. You're going to have to do the spending review. How long into the future is that spending review going to cover? Because if it's just 1 year, that's very short-term decision-making, isn't it? Don't you need to go longer than that?
The official answer I can only give you, I'm afraid, this evening is the Chancellor's going to make a statement to Parliament, which is the proper way these things should be done. I know the Tories didn't do that, but we're going to do things by the book because the adults are back in the room. The Chancellor will make that statement to Parliament before the summer, both setting out the inheritance from the Conservatives, but also confirming the date for the next Labour budget and the spending review.
But would you agree the adult thing to do is to take longer-term decisions, not just confine people to 12-month spending decisions?
Sure, we were clear in the manifesto. We want to get back to a normal multi-year settlement for public services, a longer-term view on capital investment and research and development, and you'll see that coming forward from us. But the precise details will be announced by the Chancellor to Parliament before the summer.
I mean, the message today is everything is going to take a long time. I mean, what you're really saying to us is that we're going to have to put up with bad public services for a lot longer, and you'll just keep blaming the last government. When are things actually going to change is the question in most people's minds.
Well, look, everybody knows there are some things you can do that are quick, some things that will take longer to do. In our first week and a half in government, we've already, for example, lifted the ban on onshore wind turbines. We've created the National Wealth Fund. We've unblocked planning disputes around housing development in our country. We did that within the first week. The legislation was set out today where we need to pass bills in Parliament to change the law. We'll obviously take a bit of time to get through.
But we might still face a winter crisis in the NHS, mightn't we? I mean, well, you can't fix that overnight.
Sure, well, we're working to try to make sure that's obviously not the case. But you're right that structural reforms will take some time, not least because of the financial inheritance we've had from the Conservatives. So it will be hard to begin with, but we're not shying away from taking the bold and tough decisions to fix these structural problems in the country.
Do you think we will feel change this year?
I think people are feeling change already.
Well, that's not real, though, is it? That's just sort of a sense of optimism.
You asked me if people were feeling change. I think the public are feeling optimistic about a Labour government being in the driving seat in our country, setting out now, in the momentum we have, about our absolute focus on delivering the promises we made at this election.
Can you also clear up a story that's doing the rounds in a lot of the newspapers at the moment, which is about Sue Gray, Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff? There is a suggestion that she is in some way getting very involved or over-involved in a spending decision to do with a derelict stadium in Northern Ireland. You're the man who has to take these decisions on spending.
Yes.
Has she been talking to you? Is there any truth to this story?
I speak with Sue Gray, but I speak with other members of staff and other colleagues who are ministers, of course. But spending decisions are taken by ministers and primarily by me.
So there's nothing untoward going on?
Not at all, no.
Darren Jones, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. Well, we can now talk to Chris Philp, a former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, in fact, I think under Liz Truss, who is now the shadow leader of the House of Commons. Now, there is a new law to prevent the Liz Truss disastrous mini-budget ever happening again. And you, of course, came on Channel 4 News famously and defended it at the time. Do you think this is a good a good measure to protect Britain
Well,
from any future madness?
Well, I think the OBR is an important institution, and so what I'd like to see is if Rachel Reeves comes to Parliament in the near future talking about the books, I'm assuming she will therefore be coming to Parliament with an OBR forecast, because if she comes to Parliament making claims about the public finances, claiming they're worse than they really are, without an OBR forecast, that of course won't have any credibility.
But you are now a fan of the OBR, because obviously the famous thing about that budget was there was no OBR report that went with it, and that's why it didn't have any credibility, and that's why everything went mad.
Yeah, well, I think there's some lessons to learn from that. But look, in terms of the economy now that's being handed over to Labour, we've got the highest growth in the G7 so far this year. We had those inflation numbers coming out, I think, yesterday, down at 2%, on target, lower than the Eurozone, lower than the USA. Wages growing much faster than inflation, and unemployment 4%, half what it was under the last Labour government. So Rachel Reeves and the incoming Labour administration are inheriting a really strong economy, and any claims that she may try and make in the coming days that somehow it's worse than she thought it was have no credibility whatsoever, particularly if they're not accompanied by an OBR forecast. I mean,
the thing is, I mean, you're doing a valiant job, as you always do, of putting your side's argument.
Well, the facts aren't
but you
they?
are
They're
not
facts.
you're not a real opposition yet, are you? I mean, you don't know whether you're really going to be the shadow leader of the House. We don't have a new leader. Rishi Sunak's sort of doing this sort of decent opposition thing for as long as he has to before he escapes. And the worry is that we don't really have an opposition at the moment.
Well, I don't think that's entirely fair. We've got obviously a diminished number of MPs, but we're all working hard in our new roles, and we are going to hold the Labour government to account. Look, where they do things we agree with, and many of the items in the King's speech, as many as a third of them, are things that the previous Conservative government were in the process of doing. Obviously, we'll constructively support those, but where they do things we disagree with, for example, repealing various trade union and strike laws that'll make it easier, that make strikes more common, if they're going to load up employment regulation that'll actually probably destroy jobs or make it harder for companies to create jobs, those kind of things we will obviously oppose.
But what you think will change, according to who the leadership is? I mean, we saw that with you sort of dancing on a head of a pin between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak and defending them all as right, even though they were sort of diametrically opposed. So that's the real problem, isn't it? When you say we'll oppose what we disagree with, you don't really know what you disagree with.
Well, and obviously, inevitably, we're going through a leadership contest. We're going to have that debate and we're going to work out the future direction. But in the meantime, and you heard Rishi Sunak doing it on the floor of the Commons today, I think striking the right balance between obviously accepting graciously the result of the election, saying that we'll constructively support the government where we agree, but oppose where we disagree. And things like not wanting to see loads more strikes because trade union legislation the Labour government are proposing to strip away, not wanting to see onerous employment regulations imposed that will destroy jobs. Those are things that I think all Conservatives of all flavours will agree with.
So do you think this idea of a sort of a Conservative beauty contest over the summer and going into the Conservative Party conference is the best way to choose a leader? I mean, it's basically what happened when David Cameron took leadership.
Yeah, that's my view. That is my view. I think a longer process, a bit like the one in 2005 that led to David Cameron, is what I would personally think is the best idea. I've made that case internally. I understand the party board is meeting tomorrow morning to set the timetable, so we'll know more then. But I think a longer, more thoughtful process is the right way to do it.
Chris Philp, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, how is the King's speech going down with people who voted Labour into power and those who didn't? Our senior political correspondent Paul McNamara went to Northamptonshire, where 5 of the 7 seats switched from the Conservatives to Labour, to find out.
Over time, precisely the same impact will be had by a privatised British rail, as we have seen with electricity. The private sector will run it better, and passengers will get a better service.
The results are debatable, but at the time, one group was against it.
And let's get one thing clear straight away. Of course the Labour Party believes there is a role for public ownership in our country. That's why we're fighting rail privatisation.
It's a fight, though, that's taken 3 decades and 7 prime ministers. But the plan from today, the railways are being renationalised.
I think it's an excellent idea.
Why?
Because they belong to the nation and they need to go back to the nation.
Do you think the government will be any good at running them, though?
Yes.
You in favour?
Definitely. Definitely.
And why is it? Is it the service or is it the fares?
I think they run better when they're looked after by the government.
I mean, not that they do a better job, but they're far more invested in the sense of getting a service for the people, whereas private ownership, they're all after the big bucks.
So the service is okay.
Service is very good, information is good, the service is fine, the price is not.
Welcome to Commuterville. An hour from London, an hour from Birmingham, and not a single person we spoke to was against public ownership. But this also used to be Tory heartland. Now, 5 of the 7 Northamptonshire MPs are Labour. From rail to housing.
So how many houses around here? By the time we've finished, it'll be 3,600.
Change was the theme of today's King's speech. Change that seems to be welcomed.
How confident are you that they will actually be able to deliver the houses on the scale that they'll need to put a dent in it? I'm hopeful. I'm very, very hopeful for the first time in a long, long, long time, because the rhetoric coming out of government is in the right direction. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think in the longer, medium term, we do need reform of the planning system and land availability. Yeah. But in the short term, the finance needs to drive the existing developments that are here, which are not moving as fast as they could do.
So, perhaps unsurprisingly, the property developer is in favour of plans to make it easier to develop property. Decisions in his favour, though, may come at his cost. The local council leader.
So are you in favour then of what Keir Starmer's announcing today?
I'm in favour of building more houses in general. Coming. There is a but coming, and that's that loss of local control over where they're built and how they're built. My concern is that we're going to lose residents' ability to provide their expertise on their local area.
I mean, arguably, you've got a whole load more Labour MPs around here. Local residents have already made their decision. They signed up for the Labour manifesto. That's it, you're going to have to lump it, aren't you?
We may have to lump it to a certain extent, but we'll still continue to make our voices known.
The other central tenet of today's speech, growth. A bigger economy, more workers, better jobs.
Previously, Tom was my apprentice when I was a head chef. What, Tom, we're talking 12 years ago now? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so I put him through his apprenticeship back then.
These chefs are passionate about apprenticeships. So too, say the government, are they. And they pledged today to reform the apprenticeship levy. But apprenticeships are expensive for employers, say Matt, in both time and money.
There's a lot of paperwork. We actually went to the college as well and did a demonstration up there, which is great. We'd want to work closely with them and we would take on more. But I can't afford to take on 10 apprentices and then pay everybody to then teach them, and then for them to then go to college as well.
Yeah, that's the cost start man thing.
So yeah, if he can chip in, then that would be great.
How much would you need the government to chip in to make apprenticeships actually work for you?
Per apprentice?
Yeah.
10 grand, probably, roughly. I couldn't. That's off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Roughly. Yeah.
But you need 10 grand per apprentice.
Roughly.
To make it work for you.
I'd say so. Yeah.
And it's not just apprenticeships that need a cash injection.
But there are an awful lot of developments of this size and scale which could be delivered quicker. So the housing associations have not got the funding in place that they need to deliver at the scale that the country needs. Once that funding is there, we can build extremely quickly.
So when you say the housing associations haven't got the funding in place, where would that funding come from?
Ultimately, it comes from central government. So I think it's as simple in that in the short term, I think it needs that prime pump to get it moving. Once it all starts to move in and the economy builds, the tax receipts come in, it starts to self-fund after a while. But unless you give it that kick it needs to start with, it will keep dragging at the speed.
So you are going to need central government, Keir Starmer, to stump up some?
Yes.
So Keir Starmer has promised change and hoping growth will deliver it. Wherever it comes from, says industry, change will require cash and lots of it.